the political arm that supports him. But with him as an individual and his immediate lieutenants, I think we have passed that point.
In the various briefings that you've been engaged in since you've been back with the people on the Hill and the State Department, do you tell them that you can see a light at the end of the famous tunnel?
Well, it may be a little dim down at the end of that tunnel, but we believe there is some light there. We are working various possibilities. In addition to maintaining a strong military resolve, and I believe that is UNISOM's policy, which is backed by the United States, we're willing to look at other options, although I would not say that one of them is to negotiate with Aidid. We've gone beyond that point.
General Traynor, do you think the United Nations, and my final question to you think the United Nations ought to be in the business of disarming the local people and hunting Aidid?
It depends upon the mission, Roger. I think in this instance, if there are weapons that are impeding the United Nations from providing the relief and assisting in the reconstruction and the infrastructure within the country, then I think that they have to take the legitimate steps to disarm those people or those groups who are interfering with that. That doesn't necessarily mean disarming the entire country. That would be an impossibility. But you certainly have to neutralize those who are causing problems. Now, Aidid, according to Ms. Guru, is too much of the focus of the United Nations. Well, I find that rather difficult, given the fact that he is the one that is apparently responsible for shooting and ambushing troops. The mine that went off that killed the 4 Americans was not just a normal landmine. This was a command-detonated mine, as I understand it, of the sort of the type that the Viet Cong were very fond of using, with devastating effect. This is a very sophisticated sort of mine, a very sophisticated operation, and if Aidid is behind it, he should be held accountable.
Well, just in conclusion, if the ambassador, if the light at the end of the tunnel is as dim as the ambassador says it is, we'll be talking to you again pretty soon. Thank you all very much for being with us. Robin?
Still ahead on the NewsHour, a profile of Bruce Babbitt, and regional editors assess the Clinton budget. Now a profile of Bruce Babbitt, the very busy Secretary of the Interior. The hike in federal grazing fees he announced today was only the latest in a string of compromise solutions to apparently intractable problems orchestrated by Babbitt. He was at one time on President Clinton's short list of candidates to replace Supreme Court Justice Byron White. But as Tom Bearden reports, that was before his friends begged the president not to do it.
I've spent a lot of time in politics, and I can handle my enemies, but in this case, I hope somebody will save me from my friends.
What those friends see in Bruce Babbitt is an unusual ability to forge compromises between adversaries with virtually irreconcilable differences. They say his skills are needed in the Interior Department, which must administer 500 million acres of public lands, mostly in the West, lands which are at the center of constant battles between those who want to use them and those who want to preserve them. Babbitt certainly has high hopes. He wants to fundamentally change the country's attitude toward its resources.
The largest overarching challenge is whether or not we have the capacity in this country to live a little more lightly on the land, to control resource production and development, to take into account the natural ecosystems, the river systems, the forest systems, all of the diversity of nature around us, and to accommodate the development patterns, whether it's suburban expansion or a copper mine or a forest, to leave enough room for the rest of God's creation.
Maintaining a delicate balance between those competing interests is also critical to both the Democrats and Bill Clinton's political fortunes in the West. Fred Krupp of the Environmental Defense Fund organized the campaign to keep Babbitt at Interior.
Having someone like Bruce Babbitt, who's popular both with Westerners and environmentalists, and able, instead of just dividing people, to reconcile those interests, that's very rare and very unique.
Babbitt comes by both his Western and environmental credentials honestly. His family started ranching and trading in Arizona in the 1880s and built one of the West's largest ranches. Babbitt inherited his family's affinity with the Western landscape and got a master's degree in geophysics as well as a law degree from Harvard. One of his first appearances on the national stage was in Sports Illustrated in the mid-'80s. They covered one of his grueling Grand Canyon expeditions. Historian Budge Ruffner.
There's a lot of snow in that country. He went into Jacobs Lake, 50 miles from the rim, the north rim, skied, cross-country ski, down to the north rim of the canyon, took off their skis, hiked down into the canyon, crossed the river, hiked out the other side, and carried all this stuff.
In kind of a survival mode in the winter, it sharpens the experience. You come back a little different for having, met that challenge and having prepared yourself to make decisions that have consequences. Because if you make wrong decisions, you may not come back to tell about it. And I think anyone who has ever challenged themselves that way, the outdoors, finds that they have a sharper perception of who they are and what's important.
Sharpens your ability to make tough decisions in other arenas, perhaps?
Absolutely.
Babbitt enjoys great trust in Arizona. Even so, family friend and rancher Cal Fox knows Babbitt faces a number of hard decisions at Interior, and he worries his Western heritage may take a backseat to politics.
And I think down deep that he's proud of his cattle heritage. But he speaks very little about it. And the reason for that is that he doesn't want to antagonize the very people who are supporting him so strenuously, the environmentalists.
I certainly make no apologies for the fact that I've got friends in the environmental movement, because I think they reflect what an awful lot of Americans really care about and what's been largely absent in the last 12 years.
Babbitt brings a change in philosophical attitude to Interior. He also represents a change in politics from the Reagan-Bush years. Republican Congressman John Kyle from Arizona.
He will push the environmental issues to the limit and yet try to take into account the economic interests of those who engage in grazing cattle or timbering or mining. But he is a political person, and in some respects he's an ideologue. And so I fully expect that the environmental side of the agenda will get a lot more attention with Bruce Babbitt as the Secretary of Interior.
That's music to the ears of George Miller, Democratic chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee.
Over the last 12 years, there was a very cavalier bargain basement, fire sale mentality that anybody who wanted to go onto the public lands and exploit those lands without regard to the impact was free to do so.
Babbitt is tackling a number of long-standing and seemingly intractable issues in which he says overuse of the public lands is a common thread.
My sense is that all of these public land laws have, in one way or another, rationalized excessive timber cutting, too much grazing. They view public lands as basically to be used for the benefit of the traditional commodity users. It seems to me that we've got to emphasize the public in public lands, and that means that you start to manage them for the next generation and for all of the shareholders who don't live just in Montana or Arizona.
Like all Western issues, the question of how much ranchers should pay to graze cattle on the public lands pitted ranchers against environmentalists. Although today's announcement raises fees much more than the ranchers had hoped, Babbitt went out of his way to claim the decision wasn't anti-rancher.
The objective of this is to be fair. We want to keep ranchers on the land. Why? Because many, if indeed not most ranchers, are good stewards, and their management of the land is probably, in most cases, the best environmental use of that land.
It is assumed he will apply the same principles to mining. Babbitt hopes to get the first comprehensive mining law reform in over a century through Congress by the end of this year.
I can guarantee you that we're going to be back here right after Labor Day laying out a similar proposal for mining reform. We're serious about public land reform. 1993 is the year of decision, and we're underway.
He also faces a huge challenge in rescuing the Florida Everglades. After years of lawsuits and stalemate, Babbitt announced a tentative agreement last month to be finalized in the fall.
The principles which are announced today will result in surely the largest and most ambitious ecosystem restoration ever undertaken in this country.
And then there's the settlements he has negotiated resolving court battles over the Endangered Species Act. The biggest was the spotted owl dispute in the Northwest, a classic example of the intense jobs versus the environment controversies that have been left unresolved by the Bush administration. In the 1980s, record-high timber cuts had been allowed, and timber interests wanted to continue harvesting trees off the public lands. The priority of the environmentalists was to save the habitat of the spotted owl and preserve old-growth forests. In the beginning of July, President Clinton announced a compromise, which Babbitt had a strong hand in formulating. The plan outraged loggers who saw jobs disappearing, and disappointed environmentalists who thought loopholes still threatened the forest's survival. Babbitt saw it as a reasonable compromise. He flew to the Northwest to try to convince both sides.
We've faced the possibilities of a shutdown. I mean, no jobs. The plan itself strikes a balance between jobs and the protection of old-growth timber. It's not perfect from any standpoint. It's attracted opposition from industry, from labor, from environmentalists.
Congressman Miller says it's Babbitt's style to walk right up to trouble rather than hide from it.
He also has shown the political toughness to walk right into the lion's den and explain to the lion at mealtime that we're going to renegotiate the contract.
It's a skill he repeatedly demonstrated as a two-term governor of Arizona. In fact, his crowning achievement in the State House was a compromise he forged between cities, agricultural, and mining interests over water usage. Two previous governors and a state commission had thrown up their hands in frustration over the same issue. In bone-dry Arizona, arguments over water rights used to be settled with guns. Babbitt used a conference table. Congressman Kyle was then an attorney for agriculture, the major loser at the bargaining table.
We would sit around a negotiating table for hours at a time, negotiating very minute legal principles of water law. Nobody at the table knew any more about the law than he did, so nobody could fool him in that regard. He himself had power because he was popular and intelligent, and so he could force us into positions that we might not have otherwise wanted to take with the subtle kinds of political pressure that can be brought to bear.
The 1980 Groundwater Act that resulted from the marathon negotiations is viewed as one of the most important pieces of legislation in Arizona history and has been used as a national model. As governor, Babbitt earned the respect of all sides and reshaped the office itself. John Colby is a columnist for the Phoenix Gazette.
He was a strong governor that really established a new kind of profile for the governor's office. Arizona's always had a history of weak governors, and he changed that perception, I think, forever.
It's too early to tell if Babbitt will be able to bring the same clout to the Interior Secretary's position. Over the years, Babbitt's record as an effective communicator has been mixed. Paul Eckstein went to school with Babbitt, practiced law with him, and has been active in his campaign since Babbitt ran for State Attorney General in 1974. Eckstein says Babbitt was hardly your typical politician.
As a politician, he doesn't fit the mold of a classical land-handing, backslapping politician, and he doesn't bring great oral rhetorical skills. He isn't able often to really excite and energize a crowd.
Babbitt's lack of traditional political skills hurt him when he ran for president in 1988. He didn't generate many votes, but he did get a lot of laughs when he appeared on a Saturday Night Live skit poking fun at himself and the press.
Governor, what about the character issue?
What about it?
Well, Governor, you might want to take a look at this.
I'm sorry, sir. This is the express lane. The sign says 10 items or less, and you've got 14 items.
Oh, come on, give me a break. The soup is $3 for $1. That's one item.
Still 12 items, sir.
Oh, come on. Give me a break. I'm running for president. I'm in a hurry.
Babbitt's awkwardness at politicking may actually hint at a larger problem that may trip him up in the future. While most of his admirers applaud how he minimizes political considerations, columnist Colby says Babbitt does factor them in, and not always gracefully.
He likes to analyze issues to death. And then as a politician, he seems to frequently comes in later with the sort of political considerations that a more political, more calculating politician might make first, and impose these calculations as sort of an overlay on this analysis, and the two don't always fit. They don't always fit together very well, and that's when he gets in trouble.
While Babbitt's skill in reconciling political and philosophical considerations have not yet been found lacking, the controversial changes he brings to Interior have attracted plenty of criticism from interest groups. Until recently, he seemed immune from attack from the environmental community. But now some groups are beginning to grumble. Barbara Dudley of Greenpeace questions what Babbitt has actually accomplished.
I think his deals have been easy deals. And, you know, as everyone has said around the timber deal, nobody is happy. Well, one could argue, as Bill Clinton does, that that's the perfect deal when you've made everybody unhappy, but I think we have to look at why nobody is happy. You know, nobody feels confident that anything significant was accomplished.
Babbitt says he doesn't take such criticism personally. In fact, he believes compromise and deal-making are central to good governing.
You have to have some idea of what it is your goal is. And once that's clearly defined, then I think this process of bringing people together and trying to narrow down the differences and find solutions that work is something that we haven't seen enough of it in government. And I guess the reason is that it's not a very complicated idea. It is a lot of hard work. I mean, it amounts to, you know, putting in a lot of hours. But I think it has a lot of dividends and a lot of payoff for everybody involved.
There are millions of people, ranchers, miners, loggers, farmers, vacationers, environmentalists, not to mention Bill Clinton, who are waiting to see just what those payoffs will be and whether Bruce Babbitt's reputation will survive unscathed.
Finally, some reaction from outside Washington to the budget package that squeaked through Congress last Friday. Today, President Clinton went to West Virginia to celebrate his victory over United Republicans and defecting Democrats. At today's rally at the state capitol in Charleston, the president appealed for more bipartisan support in the future.
My fellow Americans, Friday night, we began to put our economic house in order. The specifics of the day may soon fade from our memories. Even the closeness of the vote will someday fade. But what will endure is that it was at this moment that we finally decided that change had to come, that we must finally face our problems, meet our challenges, build a better future, and stop just talking about it. Now, last week was more partisan than I had hoped, and as I say, I'm very deeply grateful to the West Virginia delegation and to many others who put the national interest ahead of their personal interest. But I say to you, we have to do better. We have to do better. We cannot have every great issue of the day decided on the basis of partisanship. Scheduled around the next trip to New Hampshire for a primary still 4 years away. We have got to do some of these things together. This administration is devoted to change, but I don't care if it's called liberal or conservative or Democratic or Republican. I'm interested in tomorrow versus yesterday, in solving the real problems of the country.
For some other views of the budget process and results, we're joined by 6 regional editorial editors and writers. Ed Baumeister of the Trenton, New Jersey Times, Erwin Knoll of the Progressive Magazine in Madison, Wisconsin, Clarence Page of the Chicago Tribune, Rena Peterson of the Dallas Morning News, Cynthia Tucker of the Atlanta Constitution, and Gerald Warren of the San Diego Union Tribune. First, on what was actually accomplished, Ed Baumeister, we just heard the president claim that on Friday night we began to put our economic house in order. Does the budget victory support that claim?
I don't think so, Robin. It sounded to me that the president was trying to make chicken salad out of chicken feed there. It also shows, I think, the difference in language between Washington and the rest of the country. It was clearly a compromise. This thing was compromised 6 ways to Sunday, which in Washington is the way it's supposed to be. Politics is the art of compromise. But around my neighborhood, it's viewed as a compromise in the bad sense, that he really lost more than he gained in it.
Erwin Knoll, do you think he can fairly claim to have started to put the economic house in order with this budget?
No, we've been listening to weeks of exaggerations and false statements and outright lies from from the president, from the Democratic majority, from Senator Dole, from the Republicans. The notion that this is a great economic breakthrough is simply a consumer fraud on the American people. The notion that it's a disaster is also a consumer fraud. There's not that much there, not that much, certainly not that much money in new programs or additional funds for programs, certainly not that much stimulus to the economy. This budget will do nothing about reducing unemployment. Certainly not that big deal of a tax increase. It's about the same amount in real dollars as the one Senator Dole pushed through for Ronald Reagan in 1982. This is mostly a con job, not a significant achievement, not a great victory, not a great loss.
A con job, Cynthia Tucker?
No, I don't think so. Irwin is right when he says that this budget has been grossly exaggerated on all sides. It certainly has been, but it is still a good thing. It's just not nearly enough of a good thing. And I think the reason that the president has been celebrating so and lauding the passage of his budget is a sign of the fact that it has become very difficult in Washington to do anything about the budget deficit. I mean, this package just barely squeaked through. And it's one of those peculiar Washington deals, I think. It doesn't do very much good that it passed. It is a small step in the right direction, but it would have been disastrous had it not passed. Not only would the Clinton presidency have been dead on arrival, but I think it would have shown that Congress would have absolutely no intention of ever starting on the path of fiscal sanity. At least this is a start. It remains to be seen whether Congress is up to the task of really getting the job done.
Gerald Warren, at least it's a start. Do you agree with that?
It's a start, but it's certainly not a breakthrough. It's really an example of how the status quo is used to bring about change. The change here really is that President Clinton survived. He could very well have lost everything on this roll of the dice, and he didn't. He did survive. That is a victory, I guess. The important thing now, though, is to get beyond this, as he said, and to try to bring the two parties together to do something that changes the status quo. Mr. Clinton hasn't done that yet.
How do you see it, Clarence Page?
Well, there's one thing that I'm not hearing tonight that my newspaper did praise Clinton for, and that is putting the brakes on this growing deficit. He did not cut the deficit, which is often used in headline ease. Of course, he slowed the growth of the deficit, but he did do that. He, to some degree, reordered priorities. Irwin Noll is right. There wasn't enough money allocated to make any great change for the cities, the suburbs, or for job stimulation, but he did change the priorities of what is important to government today from the Reagan years. I think Clinton was his own worst enemy insofar as selling his own program short. He didn't go out there enough and fire back when the Republicans were calling him a tax and spend Democrat. He's showing some fiscal responsibility, and unfortunately, that's a big change for Washington these days.
How do you see it in Dallas, Rita Peterson?
Robin, I checked our letters to the editor before I left, and they're running about 2-to-1 against the president's budget program. And what people seem to be saying, the word you hear over and over, is unfair. People do not think that making tax increases retroactive is fair. They don't operate their businesses that way, and they don't think the government should either. It's a little bit like the saying that life isn't always fair, but the government should be. People also seem very concerned that there were not enough spending cuts. I don't think anybody likes taxes, but I think people here would be more willing to pay higher taxes if they thought they got something in return. On this go-round, they didn't think they got enough in return.
Jerry Warren, the president mourned the partisanship of this process. How do you see the partisanship in this particular case? You've been through a lot of wars in Washington yourself.
Well, I think the president should have his tongue in his cheek when he says that, because the Democratic leadership is the most partisan group of lawmakers I've ever seen. They thought they could do this by themselves, and they said to the Republicans, don't bother us, we'll just take care of this. And when it came down to the short rows, as we used to say in Nebraska, they found they couldn't take care of it very easily without the Republicans, so they had to blame the Republicans. I think it's silly. I think it's silly on the president's part, and I think it's silly on, to a certain extent, on Bob Dole's part.
Silly, Ed Baumeister, to blame partisanship?
Well, I think so. If you look at the result, just about half of our national legislature feels it would be punished by the voters if it voted to, as Clarence puts it, simply slow the growth of the deficit. That's a dreadful situation. They feel paralyzed.
When about 99% of them all say they want to reduce the deficit.
Yeah.
Reduce the deficit.
But if you assume that the listening mechanism of the politicians, since it's connected to their survival, is perhaps a little more acute, I think it says something about the country. And I don't think it says a very happy thing about the country. I know it's not right to blame the voters or blame the people, but these politicians were responding. Our Senator Frank Lautenberg, who's running for re-election next year, saw what happened to Bill Bradley in 2 years ago, when he would not take a stand on a state tax increase. He nearly got beat. So if you take the expression of the Congress as the will of the people, and I think it might, it's not a pretty picture.
Clarence Page, was there excessive or unusual partisanship here? I mean, it was unique that no Republican in either house voted for a package.
Well, that's very true, and I think Bill Clinton must recognize by now that he blundered early on by not moving toward a bipartisan agreement. We're certainly hearing this by the Monday morning quarterbacks in the Republican Party saying, you know, the moderate Republicans would have been more than willing to have dealt with the administration here. I think he was badly advised. There's finger-pointing going on in Washington. What's amazing to me is that people across the country are recognizing this.
So you take it as a reflection on his and the White House's political skills and not the way the Republicans played it, that there was not a single Republican vote for this?
The Republicans have not really benefited from this. I mean, I've heard Van Weber and others criticizing the fact that the Republicans have nothing to brag about except the fact that it's not their package. In other words, if this package does not succeed in improving the economy, they can point and say, we told you so. But that's not saying very much. They need a positive program to offer.
Rita Peterson, how would you think your readers in Dallas and region would view the president's claim of too much partisanship in this battle? Do they care? Or do they only care about the result?
I don't think the focus was on that. What you hear from people is they would like to see the cloth cut to fit the pattern, and they don't think that that has been done yet. The partisanship that I have heard has been in the sense of people looking ahead to the next elections, that it's going to be very tough to run in Texas on the Democratic side after this budget. We just went through a school finance reform in Texas, and as a result, Texans are going to get a very major property tax increase in October. So they'll get that increase and some more increases in April, and I think it'll be tough to run in those primaries in the spring.
Cynthia Tucker, how do you think the President and Congress come out of this battle, considering the battles, the major battles that lie ahead, particularly over health care, the North American Free Trade Area?
I don't think anybody looks good in this process, Robin. I don't think the president looked particularly good. He didn't play it as well as he should have. He didn't get his message out, as Clarence said. But Congress doesn't look good either, including the Republicans. And I think Ed Baumeister had a point earlier when he said that this says something about the American voters. I think at some point we're going to have to consider what this means for ourselves and whether we're really genuinely willing to make the sacrifices we say we are willing to make. Texas is an excellent example. Rena was talking about tax hikes in Texas earlier. Well, the two senators from Texas, Phil Gramm and Kay Hutchinson, have been harping on spending cuts over and over and over again. Yet they have both been berating President Clinton to continue supporting the $11 billion super collider. So they don't want that cut. As it turns out, nobody wants his or her own program cut. And that doesn't bode very well for the bigger problems we have ahead of us.
Irwin Knoll, is it the voter, or is, in this case, who's being represented by the result, or who's reflected in the result, or is it organized groups of voters who the congressmen are hearing from that give this impression?
Well, I don't think it's either of those. Let's not beat up on the voters unless we're ready to write off the Democratic process in its entirety. And it isn't groups of voters. What we're dealing with here are two things. One, the organized special interests, mostly financial, corporate interests, who do a powerful job of lobbying the legislators whom they have put into office with their big campaign contributions. And secondly, it's the politicians themselves who create the climate that they're now reaping the whirlwind of. For a dozen years and more now, they have propagated the notion in America that taxation is something like incest, that it's a form of vicious evil. Well, taxation is the way people organize their society to meet needs that we can't meet as individuals. And I'm looking for the first courageous member of the House or Senate who's willing to stand up and say that. And maybe a few others will join him instead of treating the idea, the very idea of taxation and public service like a plague.
Jerry Warren, what do you think this says, this result and the way it was handled in Congress and by the White House says about what's ahead in the next 6 months? Healthcare, NAFTA?
Well, I think the Congress, members of Congress are finally listening to what the voting public said in the last presidential election. Yes, they want the deficit cut, but they want the cost of government cut. They don't want more taxes until government spending is brought under control, and it hasn't been done yet. As far as looking toward the future, I think Republicans are going to want to find a way to support the president on something that they believe in, and I think the North America Free Trade Agreement is that vehicle. I think unless the negotiators do something stupid on the side agreements for worker retraining and for environment, that a lot of Republicans can support that and should and give the president a good victory.
Well, we have to leave it there. Thank you all for joining us again.
Again, the major stories of this Monday: the U.S. and its NATO allies have reached agreement on a plan to bomb Serbian targets across Bosnia. The UN would have to approve any attack. But at the same time, Serbian forces began withdrawing from some strategic positions overlooking the embattled capital, Sarajevo. And the U.S. will strengthen security for its troops in Somalia after 4 were killed by a landmine. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Roger. That's the News Hour for tonight, and we'll see you again tomorrow night. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
New York Life is proud to provide funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer News Hour. Yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. Funding has also been provided by PepsiCo. And by the Archer Daniels Midland Company. ADM, supermarket to the world. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
I'm Tess Vigland of OPB Radio. Join us tomorrow for NPR's Morning Edition. More anti-Semitic acts in Russia indicate that conditions may be getting worse for Jews there. That story and more tomorrow from 5 to 9 on OPB Radio.
Video cassettes of the MacNeil-Lehrer News Hour are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1.
This is PBS.
Funding for local broadcast of MacNeil-Lehrer has been provided by Norm Thompson Outfitters, an escape from the ordinary. Located at Northwest 18th and Thurman, Southwest 4th and Morrison, and at the Portland Airport.